All right. So last week we started talking about life in the typical Jewish family during Bible times, and I got most of the way through it, but there was still a few more things that I wanted to talk about and to finish that before I then start talking about what education was like during Bible times. So this is a life in a Jewish family of Bible times. And the last thing we had talked about was the betrothal, the engagement. So let's talk about what weddings were like back then. There are several important parts to the wedding itself. The wedding ceremony included a blessing that would be pronounced over the couple. There's an example of that in Genesis 24:60. It says, "And they blessed Rebekah and said unto her, Thou art our sister, be thou the mother of thousands of millions, and let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them." So that blessing would be said over new couples. The marriage itself involved the drafting and the acceptance of a legal contract, because that's really what it is. That's still true of a Jewish wedding today. There would be a legal contract. And you might be surprised to know that it was only in comparatively recent times that a rabbi or one of the priests would even be required to be at a wedding. It was more a legal arrangement than it was necessarily a religious event. An important element of the wedding then was the procession. At the end of the first day, the bridegroom would set out from his home to fetch his bride from her parents' home. And at that point, the bride would be wearing a veil. But as I told you in the first lesson, at some point that veil was taken off and it would be laid on the shoulder of the bridegroom, and a declaration was made that said, "The government shall be upon his shoulder." And we know that from Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, that would be spoken of Christ because of the responsibility and the authority held by the bridegroom. So that procession would then set out to the bride's home, to the couple's new home, and it would typically get dark about that time. So the roadway would be lit with oil lamps held by the wedding guests. So the story that Jesus told about the bride and groom arriving later than expected, so that the oil in their lamps had begun to run low, and only those who had brought a flask of reserve oil were able to refill their lamps and welcome the bride and groom. Message on being prepared. The wedding feast, the bride and groom then for the wedding feast, they would enter under a canopy when they arrived at the house. Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 4, seems to be mentioning that. It says, "His banner over me was love." There, they presided over the wedding feast, at which a great deal of time was spent eating and drinking. At the wedding in Cana, for example, Jesus provided 120 gallons of wine for the guests. John chapter 2, verse 6 says, 6 water pots of stone were there, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. If you turn that into our measurements, it was about 120 gallons. And in that story, the person in charge, called the ruler of the feast, the wedding planner, I guess you might call him today, thought it was a pity that the excellent new wine should have been left into the end. John chapter 2, verses 6 to 10. What maybe isn't clear in our culture and our understanding, new wine is what Jesus created, and that was fresh grape juice mixed, sweetened with sugar. It was not alcohol. It was grape juice mixed with sugar. The festivities for a wedding feast, they often lasted 7 days, sometimes even longer. Judges 14, verse 12 is an example. The guests were there as witnesses that the marriage had been consummated. Yeah, I know that sounds weird. But you see an example in Genesis 29, verses 22 and 23. It says, "And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought him to her, and he went in unto her." So in this case, it seems that wedding veil didn't get removed from Leah's face until the marriage had already been consummated, because Jacob didn't know he had married Leah until the light of day. Talk about a surprise. Yeah. Let me say a little bit about divorce. In a couple of words, it's complicated. In Bible times, women had no legal power to divorce their husbands. Instead, they simply left, but they could not get a divorce. That was not a legal right that they had. 1 Corinthians, we see this in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 and 13. Paul says, "But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away." Now, the Greek word for that was aphiemi, and that was the word for divorce. He's saying, don't divorce her. Verse 13, "And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him." No divorce. All that could happen is she would leave. She could walk out, but she couldn't get a divorce. Marriages could, they did break up, and it was possible for a man to divorce his wife if he could find, according to Deuteronomy 24:1, some uncleanness in her. And Jewish lawyers of the time, they interpreted that phrase in different ways. In the time of Jesus, the followers of Shammai believed that it referred to adultery or sexual misconduct only. But then there were those who followed another rabbi by the name of Hillel, who believed that the phrase could be interpreted for anything, burning dinner and you're divorced. Yeah. In society at that time, it was possible for a man to divorce his wife simply by announcing, "I'm divorcing you," and it was over. But the Jews required the giving of a written bill of divorcement that nullified the original marriage contract. And part of the bill of divorcement, or it was also called a writ of divorcement, it allowed the woman to remarry. Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 and 2 says, "When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she's departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife." But in that same section, in Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29, it says that if a man had sexual relations with a girl who was not betrothed and not married, he had to marry her. The originations of a shotgun wedding, you might call it, but he could never divorce her. He could never divorce her. Again, that's Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 and 29. A little bit about the culture and how it viewed death back then. A man's life was considered complete when he hit 70 years old. Glad it's not that way anymore, but Psalm 90 verse 10 says, "The days of our years are 80 years and 10. That's 70. Now, most people at that time, they died before that. The life expectancy didn't reach 70. But there were some notable exceptions, of course, in the Bible. Who is the oldest person in the Bible? Methuselah. How old did he live to be? 969 years old, for sure. Now, death was the final event that had rites of passage, so to speak, for the Israelites. In early Israelite history, Israelites, they really knew nothing about life after death. It hadn't yet been revealed. Parents believed that they would live on through their children. That's why, for example, the writer of Hebrews, which I believe was the Apostle Paul, said that when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, Levi was already in Abraham's loins. So Levi, therefore, paid tithes to the Jerusalem king, and Levi's priesthood, therefore, was judged to be inferior to that of Melchizedek's. And the point that Paul is making there is by extension also to Christ's priesthood, which was after the order of Melchizedek. People believe that after death, they were gathered into some kind of underworld that they called Sheol. You probably heard that word before. And there they were considered, they appeared as, they called them shades or shadows of their past selves. And it was not until the time of Daniel that there was any biblical revelation that there would be a resurrection one day. Some to eternal life and some to eternal punishment. That's Daniel 12, verse 2. But it wasn't until Jesus had opened the kingdom of heaven to all believers and had become the first fruits of them that slept, 1 Corinthians 15:20, that the truth of the coming resurrection was really made clear. So that's only explained to us in the New Testament. When somebody died, immediately upon their death, there was a time of wailing and lamentation. The wail was an announcement to the neighborhood that a death had taken place. At the original Passover, the Egyptians had so many dead on that occasion that it was said that the wail could be heard throughout the entire country. The family would then gather together for lamentation, a time of great show of weeping, almost as if those who were still alive wanted to impress the shadow, the ghost of the dead person, that they were really sorry to lose them. Micah described the sound. He said it sounded like dragons and owls, Micah 1:8. Therefore I will wail and howl. I will go stripped and naked. I will make a wailing like the dragons and mourning as the owls. Jesus was obviously aware of this wailing when he went to raise Jairus' daughter at the synagogue in Capernaum, Mark chapter 5, verse 38. And we see an example of this in David's expression of grief for his son Absalom. In 2 Samuel 18:33, it says, "And the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." Now, wealthy families, they would hire groups of professional mourners who would then further add to all the noise. Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 17 and 18, an example of that, Amos 5:16. The mourners would wear garments made of goat's hair called sackcloth. They were worn because they caused a great deal of discomfort. Another sign of the grief would be beating on the chest, Luke 23:48. And clothes were oftentimes torn to demonstrate how grief-stricken people were, 2 Samuel 3:31. The burial had to take place quickly because of the hot climate would accelerate decomposition. However, a burial would never take place on a Sabbath day or on a holy day. John 11:39 and 19:31 are examples of that. The body was normally washed. It was wrapped loosely in a linen cloth and then carried to a burial place on a wooden stretcher. The burial could take place oftentimes in a natural cave or in an artificial one if they made one, a sepulcher. Genesis 49 and Judges 8 have examples of that. Now, natural caves, when they found those and used them for burial, they would widen them out, dig them out further, and carve in niches or shelves on the sides of the walls where the bodies could be laid to rest. And because there was really a limited number of caves available for doing that, when the bodies had decomposed, and typically they would go back a year after the burial, and the bones then would be all that would be left, and they would take those bones and put them into stone jars called ossuaries, and those jars would then be stored in a corner of the sepulcher, and then the niches would be available for somebody else to be buried there. The mouth of the tomb was sealed either with like a disc-shaped stone that ran along an inclined groove down in front of the opening of the cave, or perhaps with a boulder that was placed in the access hole to seal the tomb. Either way, the stone was very difficult to move once it was in place. Burial caves and sepulchers, they were painted white as a warning that to the living that the dead were there. Matthew 23:27 mentions that, because if somebody touched a dead body in Bible times, they were considered unclean for 7 days. Alternatively, burial could be done by laying the stretcher on the ground and surrounding the body with boulders about 18 inches in diameter in a rough oblong shape all around the body, and then the body would be covered with earth, and the boulders formed a boundary for the grave. But burial like this was not common because of the hardness of the ground in the land of Israel. These kind of graveyards, they were always outside the village or the town, Luke 7:12. The only people who were ever buried within a city would be royalty. An example of that in 1 Kings 2. Occasionally, if the deceased was rich, then the body would be covered in spices and held in with a paste. These were tied to the body with layers of white rolling bandages. The paste would harden and impregnate the bandages until a hard preservative mold, like a cocoon, was formed around the body. And a cap was placed on the head, and the jaw was typically held in place with a bandage, a chin bandage. This was done for Jesus. But he obviously, we know he was not wealthy, but this was done for him by two wealthy men after the initial burial in the simple sheet, John 19:40. In Lazarus's case, his hands and feet appear to have been bound before he was wrapped in a sheet, and his jaw was also bound with a bandage. You see that in John 11. Now, because Jesus was wrapped like in a cocoon, you can understand why the disciples saw and believed in the resurrection, why the body had not been stolen. Jesus' body had passed through the cocoon of the spice-impregnated bandages, just as it did when he walked through the door of the upper room. So, looking through the doorway of the tomb, the Apostle John thought that the body was still there because he could see that cocoon, and therefore he wouldn't enter. But along comes Peter and runs right in. And so Peter went in and he saw a gap where the face was supposed to be. Only then did they realize what had happened. John 20 verse 7 says, "And the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself." What about embalming? Well, embalming was carried out in Egypt, where the removal of the internal organs would take place. The body would be filled with like a paste, and the organs were kept in a jar. We see examples of this in Genesis 50, verse 2. "And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel." Same thing happened for Joseph himself in Genesis 50:26. So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. The reason he was put in a coffin because he didn't stay in Egypt. When the Jews left, they took that coffin with them. In Israel, following the burial, there would be a funeral meal to conclude the period of mourning, and that often lasted for a week or more, Deuteronomy 34. Now, widows, a woman who survived her husband was oftentimes in a really difficult position. She could not inherit from her husband. She could remain in her husband's family if the next of kin, for example, would take her in as a wife, but more often the widow had no financial support. So the law, therefore, said that widows were to be protected. Deuteronomy 10, 18, and 24, verses 17 to 21. You find that. In the early church, money was to be set aside for the care of widows, Acts 6:1. And Paul expected widows to be supported by their families. That's in 1 Timothy 5. But if the widow had no family to take care of them, then the local church was instructed to take care of them if they had lived good lives, and they also had to be over the age of 60, according to 1 Timothy 5. So let's talk about education. Education is fundamental to the whole human race. Historically, education has always taken place within families, but as the skills and the understanding developed and money became available to pay for it, then broader education became available to more people, and this process is seen in the Bible. Education in Abraham's time, for instance, which was in ancient Sumeria. Before he was called by God, Abraham lived in the city of Ur, which was a major Sumerian city-state in ancient Mesopotamia that was founded back in 3800 BC. Now, the Bible refers to it as Ur the Chaldees in Genesis 11:28, but it was not known by that name until about the 9th century BC. Ur was a highly civilized city, and they had schools that were used to train people for religious and commercial and governmental work. The curriculum typically involved mathematics, languages, geography, botany, drawing, so it was extensive. And the schools were called tablet houses because writing was done with like a wedge-shaped stylus that was pressed into soft clay tablets. They have found clay tablets from the city of Mari showing the children's exercises and the teacher's corrections. A school father ran the school, and he would have an assistant who prepared the exercises. They also had teachers for special subjects. One of the tablets that they recovered at Mari tells exactly what a boy did in school, and the inscription on it in English says, "I read my tablet, ate my lunch, prepared my tablet, wrote it, and finished it." Bad behavior in school was corrected with the use of a cane. And the parents had to pay for their children's education. It was not free. Now, there's no evidence in the Bible that Abraham went to one of those tablet houses, but he certainly followed the laws of the Sumerians. The custom of a childless wife having children by proxy through a servant girl, the way that Abraham did in Genesis 16. That was a Sumerian custom. But it was a law that when the child was born, the servant girl should not be ill-treated by the wife, as Sarah did mistreat her in Genesis 16, verse 6. When Sarah wanted Hagar and Ishmael to be sent away from the family home, we see that Abraham was really uneasy about that, and he had to have God's assurance that indeed he should let them go. Genesis 21, verses 10 to 12. How about education in Moses' time in ancient Egypt? Because he was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter, Bible tells us in Acts 7:22 that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And according to Jewish tradition, that included arithmetic, geometry, poetry, music, astronomy, and a lot of other subjects. So it was an extensive education. And Moses, again, because he was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter, he would have been taught by the teacher of the king's children. And he would have learned how to write Egyptian hieroglyphics with ink on papyrus. And he most likely also learned the Canaanite script, the Canaanite language, since Canaan was linked to Egypt at that time. When God told Moses to teach the law to the people, it was effected through repetition and example. Example that Deuteronomy 11:19. It included public reading, Deuteronomy 31, and the use of songwriting, Deuteronomy 31, verse 19. So educational songs go all the way back to ancient Egypt. It did not start with singing your ABCs. It's been around a long, long time. So since it was common in Egypt to teach through singing, that probably reflects how Moses was taught. What about Jewish education then once they were in the Promised Land? When the Jewish people moved from the desert into Canaan, they did not have a sophisticated educational system. That system developed as their civilization developed, and it was influenced by the practices of the surrounding nations. Initially, therefore, education was centered in the home, and the education of both boys and girls was the mother's responsibility for the first 3 years of life, probably until the child was weaned. For the girls, she taught the girls their domestic duties all the way through their childhood. But boys were taught the law by their fathers from the age of 3, and fathers were also responsible for teaching their sons a trade. They found a writing, a rabbi once said, "He who does not teach his son a useful trade is bringing him up to be a thief." That's why Jesus, for example, is referred to not just as the carpenter's son in Matthew 13:55. He is also referred to as the carpenter in Mark 6:3. So he learned it from Joseph, his father. Fathers taught the children the family business, whatever it might be. And we see an example of that in 1 Chronicles 4:21, which refers to the families of the house of them that wrought fine linen, of the house of Ashbia. So that household, their family business was making linen. And girls also trained for certain professional roles. Surprise, surprise. But they were things like midwifery, Exodus chapter 1, 15 to 21, and also singing, Ecclesiastes 2:8. Education in the Holy Land, it was primarily religious, enabling the children to understand the nature of God through what he had done and what he required in the law. A key passage of Scripture for the Jews, Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5, it's called the words of the Shema. The word itself means hear, and it was the creed of Israel. You've heard this many times before. Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might." So this was taught to the Israelites. It was talked about. It was used in worship, and Jews were reminded of the Shema every time they entered or left a Jewish house, because the Shema was written on the doorposts, as instructed in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. Now, children were encouraged to ask questions about the Jewish festivals that happened each year. See examples in Exodus 12 and in Deuteronomy 6. And the unusual symbols of Judaism were intended to provoke the children to ask questions. Here's an example of this from Exodus chapter 13, verses 11 to 15. It says, "And it shall be when the Lord shall bring thee into the land of the Canaanites, as he sware unto thee and to thy fathers, and shall give it thee, that thou shalt set apart unto the Lord all that openeth the matrix, and every firstling that cometh of a beast which thou hast, the male shall be the Lord's. And every firstling of an ass thou shalt redeem with a lamb. And if thou wilt not redeem it, then thou shalt break his neck, and all the firstborn of man among thy children shalt thou redeem. And it shall be, when thy son asketh thee in time to come, saying, What is this? That thou shalt say unto him, By strength of hand the Lord brought us out from Egypt, from the house of bondage. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh would hardly let us go, that the Lord slew all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all that openeth the matrix, being males. But all the firstborn of my children I redeem. So that's what a Jewish father was instructed to say to his children when they would ask him, why are you doing this? So they were used as symbols. The symbols and the rituals became a natural way for parents to teach their children about the acts of God. As the temple and the synagogues became part of Jewish life, the personnel, the people who worked there, began to provide some kind of formal education for children. Samuel, for example, he was taught by Eli the priest in Shiloh. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And Samuel himself, he later established a school of the prophets in Ramah. 1 Samuel chapter 19 tells us about that. And that school of the prophets then later developed into some kind of theological school. We see it talked about in 2 Kings chapter 2 and Isaiah 8:16. Now, writing history was an important function at those schools. Although people still listen to the reading of the law, as we see in Deuteronomy 31, a considerable number of people could now read and write because of the efforts of having a regular education. Judges 8:14 tells how a young man wrote a list of all the names for Gideon. And when Hezekiah had a water tunnel built under the city of Jerusalem, the workmen involved inscribed a message on the wall at the point where the tunnels met. So writing was often done in ink on broken pieces of pottery shards. Pens were typically made from a piece of cane that was sharpened to a point. Jeremiah 17:1 tells us that. And the ink that they used, it was made from soot and from resin, from olive oil and water mixed together. There was both Assyrian and Babylonian influences in the educational system. It was the exile of the Jews into Assyria and Babylon that led to further developments in education, because the Assyrian king collected thousands of clay tablets and formed a library in the city of Nineveh. And they contained every kind of knowledge: botany, geometry, chemistry, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, law, religion, all kinds of information. And they indicate just how far the Assyrian education system had developed. Daniel chapter 1 tells how members of the Israelite hierarchy, they were educated in the Babylonian courts. They were to learn the language for 3 years, and then they had to take an oral examination set by the king. That's seen in Daniel chapter 1. In order to preserve their identity as a nation, it was therefore necessary for the Jews who were in exile to become completely familiar with their own law. And because of that, it was the priests and the prophets who assumed responsibility for the education. And this continued when the Jews eventually returned to their own land. Word about the scribes. When the Jews returned from exile, they were led by Ezra, a guy who was a priest and a scribe, which meant an interpreter of the law. And he was commissioned by the Persian emperor to teach the Jewish people the law. We see this in Ezra chapter 7. And Nehemiah chapter 8, the first 8 verses, tells us that when they rebuilt and rededicated the city of Jerusalem, everyone who returned stood in the streets from morning to midday to listen to the reading of the law. That means Ezra stood up there and he read Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Sometimes I silently complain that my back is hurting when we have to stand up for too long. They stood from morning till midday to listen to 5 books of the Old Testament being read. And then more than a dozen teachers took turns speaking to the crowd, explaining the law that had just been read to them. So it was a long service. Because of their role as teachers of the law, the scribes, they became very important members of the community. And a scribe also had the job of writing letters for people who couldn't. Scribes could be recognized because they would carry, quote, a writer's inkhorn on their belt. That's Ezekiel 9, verse 2. The synagogue itself seems to have come into being during the time of the exile, as people would gather together to learn the Torah and the other sacred writings. In fact, the word synagogue literally means a place of assembly. It's a Greek word. It means a place of assembly. So when the Jews returned to their homeland, they continued the practice of listening to the scriptures being read and interpreted. And Jesus took that role, for example, in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 22, when he told them, "This day the scripture is fulfilled in your ears." And the buildings where this took place became the centers of worship. Some of the scribes, they differed in their interpretations of the law. The school of Hillel, which I mentioned earlier, they had kind of a lenient interpretation of law. They're the ones who say you could divorce your wife if she burns your dinner. But then there was the school of Shammai, who took a much stricter line. And the teachings of the scribes, they were eventually compiled into large collections and eventually written down as in what Jews call the Mishnah. There was Greek culture influence on education in Israel. With Israel as part of the Greek Empire, it wasn't long before the returned exiles came under the influence of Greek thought and Greek culture. And their country of Israel fell under the Seleucid rule, which took place in Syria. The wealthy and the priestly families accepted the culture and began using the Greek language and literature, and even allowed the Greek games in Jerusalem. These Jews, like the Greeks who influenced them, rejected traditional beliefs in angels, in the resurrection, in the providence of God, and they became known as Hellenists. But many Jews strongly opposed these views, particularly when the Greek games were introduced into the city. Some reacted basically just to foster a sense of national pride, but others, known as the Hasidim, Hasidim, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not, Hasidim, they were a lot more concerned about how the Greek philosophies would undermine the building of a strong Jewish faith. And a little later in history, the Hasidim were called by another name, which I'll mention in just a moment. Eventually, though, the Hellenists, these Greek-following Jews, they agreed to establish a Greek school, which was called a gymnasium. We think of a gymnasium as a place for exercise. It was actually a school, higher education. They established one in Jerusalem in 175 BC, and a lot of wealthy Jews sent their sons there to receive a Greek education. So a child educated in this system attended school beginning at the age of 7 if his parents could afford the fees. And in the school, he studied basic skills such as reading and writing and arithmetic, but he also studied art, poetry, dance, musical instruments, and he also studied physical skills, wrestling and boxing and running, throwing javelins, throwing a discus. The Greek games even found their way into biblical teachings in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 26 and 27, where it talks about if a man strives for the mastery. At 16, the student then enrolled in the gymnasium. That was higher education, and there he would study literature and philosophy and politics. That was the equivalent of their college. Now, interested adults who live locally, they were invited to the classes for times of discussion, and outstanding teachers would set up their own schools in the city of Athens, for example, and those who wished to learn from them went there. And this was under the general supervision of what was called the Areopagus, A-R-E-O, Areopagus, A-R-E-O-P-A-G-U-S. That was basically the ruling committee of the area that had oversight over education and other matters of government. And Paul used this Athenian system to teach the gospel. And Paul actually spoke in the Areopagus. We see that in Acts chapter 17. In the city of Ephesus, he used the lecture hall of a teacher named Tyrannus as a base for preaching. That's in Acts chapter 19. A little later, the Seleucid king who was responsible for the Greek school in Jerusalem, he was defeated in battle in 164 BC. And when that happened, the Hasidim, or as they were now being called, the Pharisees, led by Simon ben Shetta, insisted that all Jewish boys would have to attend, they called it the House of the Book, for a Jewish education. It was to be led by a teacher who was paid by the synagogue. Teachers had to be married men of good character. And higher education was available at what they called the House of Study. And such a school was attached to the Jerusalem temple, for example. That's where Jesus was found when he was 12 years old in Luke chapter 2. He was found in the House of Study. Jesus would have gone as a child to the House of the Book in Nazareth when he was about 6 years old. And the children would sit in a semicircle on the floor facing the teacher. And a lot of the teaching was done by means of repetition and memorization. Writing would be done on wooden tablets, Luke 1:63, or even on the ground, as Jesus demonstrated in John 8:6. The only textbook that they had in those schools was what they called the Tanakh. That was the law, the prophets, and the writings. We know it by another name, the Old Testament. Isaiah 28 verses 9 and 10 speaks of this method of teaching by rote. It says, whom shall he teach knowledge, and whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. So the people they were complaining about the way that the prophet is teaching them. For it's do and rule on rule, and a little here, a little there. It literally means S after S, Q after Q. And it refers to this method of teaching by repetition. The master would say the letter S, for example, and all the students would have to repeat it. That's how it worked. The traditional law was taught from the age of 10 to 15, and then the Jewish law was taught beyond that. And the brightest boys of the boys, such as Paul when he was young, could go to Jerusalem to one of the schools of law. And they would sit at the feet of the great teachers. And Paul talked about this himself in Acts 22, verse 3. He said, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. So he was one of those famous teachers, and Paul was his student. One final thing, because we're almost out of time. Galatians 3:24 says, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. This term of schoolmaster oftentimes confuses people. They think that it refers to a teacher, but the schoolmaster was not the teacher. The schoolmaster was a household servant whose job it was to take the master's sons to school and make sure they didn't get into mischief along the way. So Paul says that Jesus was the real teacher. The Jewish law that he's referring to here was simply the servant who took the students to school safely. The schoolmaster isn't the teacher, it's the school bus, to put it in today's terms. The school bus to make sure that the students got where they're supposed to be going. That's the schoolmaster. And we are out of time for today, so we'll have a word of prayer, and we'll pick it up in 2 weeks.